Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar about salaried hours. My name is John Cheney, and I'll be presenting the webinar today. This webinar will last around 45 minutes. The information you will be receiving today is correct at the time of delivery, which is February 2026, and our guidance is updated regularly, so we advise you to refer to gov.uk for regular updates. To make sure you get the most from this session, we've designed it as a focused presentation without a live Q&A. This just means that we can cover everything thoroughly, ensuring that you give your full attention to the content. No need to split your focus between listening and thinking up questions on the spot. Of course, we know questions will come up, or you have questions that you will want to ask, and we want to hear them with the aims to support you as much as possible. So, at the end of the presentation, we'll share details of our mailbox where you can send any queries. This actually works in your favour. You'll have time to reflect on what you've learned, and our team can give your questions the considered responses they deserve. Closed captions are available. If you would like closed captions on, please press the CC button on the bottom of the screen. We have handouts available in both Word and PDF format. You can download at any time during the webinar. To find the handouts, click on the document icon on the left-hand side of the screen. The handouts contain links to further guidance. A few hours after the webinar finishes, you will receive an email with a link to this recording and a copy of the handouts from today's session. This webinar is designed to give employers an introduction into the world of salaried calculations. After speaking to so many employers, it's clear the majority aren't aware of what needs to be done, and as a result, underpayments occur. We want to change that, and we want to help you get the national minimum wage right. I'm going to talk about the following points in today's webinar. A brief introduction of work type and establishing salaried hours work, an example going through each calculation step by step, additional points to consider, the importance of keeping records, and what happens when problems occur. So let's get started with a brief introduction. When it comes to the national minimum wage, some employers think to calculate the minimum wage, I just take their yearly amount and divide it by the hours worked. If that amount is higher than the minimum wage, then I'm fine. I'm sorry to tell you, but that's not how it works. There are 4 types of workers for minimum wage purposes: salaried, time, output, unmeasured. Depending on the type of work being performed has an impact on the calculation. That's where people often misunderstand. The national minimum wage is more than just a pay rate, it's a calculation. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, understand the reason we say this. On today's webinar, we are solely going to concentrate on workers performing salaried hours. I'm not going to go in depth explaining the conditions to be performing salaried hours work. We already have a dedicated webinar for this. However, what I will do is just to give you a quick recap, just to give you some foundation knowledge. In a nutshell, these are the 4 conditions for a worker to be performing salaried hours work. Paid for a set basic hours for the year as per their employment contract. They are entitled to a basic salary for those hours. They are not entitled to any other pay for the basic hours except for performance bonuses or salary premiums. They are paid in equal instalments, which are monthly, weekly, 2-weekly, or 4-weekly. Alternatively, they can be paid in monthly instalments that vary but add up to the same amount each quarter. Like I said, I'm not going to go in depth in this, but I will explain more about condition 1 as this generates the most questions. This is all about being paid for a set number of basic hours for the year. This needs to be in the employment contract. You do not specifically have to put in the yearly hours, like for example 1,924. You can easily write the weekly or monthly hours as long as you, as an employer, can demonstrate what the yearly hours are. Say if you have a worker contracted to 37 hours per week, some employers calculate the basic hours by multiplying weekly hours by 52, while others, understanding that there are more than 52 weeks in a year, they choose 52.14. There we have it, the 4 conditions to be deemed as performing salaried hours work. Now let's move on to the calculations employers need to do for salaried workers. There are effectively 3 different types of calculations. The first calculation is to check if workers are being paid correctly in a pay reference period. I'm going to slightly digress away from this calculation for just those people who don't know what a pay reference period is. A pay reference period is simply a period of time for which someone is paid. For example, you pay your staff £2,000 for the month. Great. What period of time is that payment for? Some employers will start the pay reference period on the first of the month and finish it on the last of the month. Other employers may start it on a specific date of the month, like the 10th of the month until the 9th of the following month. It's all up to you, as an employer, to decide. Usually, pay reference periods can be any length of time as long as it is less than 1 calendar month, but for salaried purposes, the pay reference period has to be a minimum of a week. So to summarise, for salaried purposes, the pay reference period has to be a minimum of 1 week and a maximum of 1 month. Anyway, back to the first calculation. Say if you pay your workers monthly, you will need to check every single month. The best way to think about this smaller calculation is that you are looking out for pay elements, salary sacrifice, deductions, and any other elements that could take workers' pay below national minimum wage rates. Working time is considered, but only their contractual working time. Just for ease, I'm going to call this a PRP calculation. The second calculation is the excess hours check. This is when working time comes into play and employers need to perform a calculation over an entire year. If an employer does this check and there is no indication a worker has gone over their basic contractual hours for the year, you can stop right there and there's nothing else that needs to be done. If it's the opposite and employers find that a worker has gone over their basic hours, that's when you need to continue. The third calculation is technically still part of the excess hours calculation, but it is easier to talk about it as a third calculation, just to break everything down. I'm just calling it as it is, the working time adjustment calculation. This is when employers have to examine the pay reference period where the excess for the year has occurred and calculate an adjusted time figure for national minimum wage purposes. Though there are 3 distinct calculations an employer should do, they should actually do 4. What's the fourth calculation, I hear you ask? Well, it's just a repeat of the PRP calculation with the adjusted working time. So to summarise, we have the PRP calculation, the excess hours calculation, and the working time adjustment calculation. Now you might be in a position where all you are doing is simply paying a worker's salary against their contractual hours. That's no problem at all, as long as the worker is only working their contractual hours. It's when they work more than their contractual hours is when you start having to do these calculations. I'm going to go through an example with you all, which will cover all of these calculations. The example is a very basic one. For instance, I'm not going to go through what happens if someone starts partway through a month or leaves partway through a year, because that is more advanced, and this example is just to give employers an introduction. However, I will explain some of the more advanced issues later in the webinar. In this example, we will be looking at Ben. Ben is 22 years old and works for a marketing company called Cookie. And to get straight to the point, yes, Ben has been underpaid the national minimum wage. Why? A couple of reasons. He's been working additional time with no additional pay and has a salary sacrifice. That's why there is an underpayment. But let's ask another question. How? How has Ben been underpaid? The how will all become clear throughout these calculations. Let's set the scene. Ben started work on the 1st of April 2025. He is deemed to be performing salaried hours work. His contractual hours for the year is 1,924, with an annual salary of £30,000. When he started, his employer advised of a 5% auto-enrolment pension, of which is undertaken via a salary sacrifice. When looking at his employment contract, Ben saw his contractual hours for the week. Everything seemed fine, but then he saw something next to it. It said, although you are contracted to work your basic hours, you must also work as many hours as necessary to complete your work projects and/or tasks. And lo and behold, That's exactly what happened to Ben. He often worked more hours than his basic contractual hours, but without being paid for the additional time. Ben is fine with this arrangement. He wants to show his employer how dedicated he is. But I want to remind everyone that workers cannot sign their national minimum wage entitlement away. No matter what happens, Ben is entitled to be paid the national minimum wage for all his time worked. Let's start with the first calculation, the PRP calculation, that is. In April 2025, Ben's basic pay for the month appears to be £2,500. That's £30,000 for the year divided by 12. However, a reduction in national minimum wage pay occurs because Ben has sacrificed part of his pay in exchange for something else. In this case, it's the 5% auto-enrollment pension, which in this scenario is a salary sacrifice. And yes, I can imagine a lot of you are thinking, but auto-enrollment, we have no choice. It's part of legislation. Yes, it is, but you don't have to do auto-enrollment via a salary sacrifice. I've included a link in the handout that explains this. Anyway, let's get back to the example. The contractual pay needs to be reduced by 5%. 5% of 2,500 is 125. Therefore, Ben's contractual pay needs to be reduced by £125. So that's £2,500 less £125 equaling £2,375. That means for national minimum wage purposes, Ben's pay from Cookie is actually £2,375. So that's one half of the equation done. We know what Ben's minimum wage pay is. When it comes to Ben's working time, the yearly contractual hours is 1,924. So we simply divide that figure by 12, and that means the contractual hours for the month is 160.33. Even though we know that Ben is working more than his contractual hours, for this PRP calculation, we only use the contractual hours. We know Ben's minimum wage pay, and we know the contractual hours amount. It's time to find the hourly rate. This is just pay divided by time. So that's £2,375 divided by 160.33 hours. And that gives us an hourly rate of £14.81. The good news here is that Ben is entitled to receive at least £12.21 per hour. That is the 2025-26 national minimum wage rate for people aged 21 and over. As Ben is earning over £12.21 per hour, there are no issues here because Cookie is paying Ben above the national minimum wage. Some of you are probably thinking, but you said Ben had been underpaid, but now you've just shown us that he isn't underpaid. That's only because we haven't done an excess hours check yet. In fact, most employers will only do this smaller PRP calculation to determine if national minimum wage has been paid. I've led multiple compliance checks and this is exactly what I've seen. So you can understand why so many employers are surprised when HMRC says they have underpaid their workers. So let's just assume every PRP from April 2025 to March 2026 is the exact same. In theory, no issues. Now it's time to start the excess hours check, and this is when we see the cookie crumble. The excess hours check is performed over a calculation year. The year begins when the worker starts with your business, but this can be changed. I'll talk about this more later on in the webinar. Like I said, Ben started on 1st of April 2025, meaning his calculation years are 1st of April to 31st of March each year. So let's see the calculation year for 2025-26. As you can see here, Ben has to log his actual working time every day. In April, he worked 165 hours, May, he worked 180 hours, and in June, 200 hours. This table I've made just shows the hours Ben is supposed to work and how much he has actually worked. This is vital to perform excess hours calculations. Remember, Ben's contractual hours for the year is 1,924. As you can see here, Ben has worked so many hours by February, he's gone over his yearly contractual hours. The next step is to identify the actual amount of hours worked in February after the basic hours were exceeded. This leads us to the working time adjustment calculation. Let's have a look at February. It looks like Ben not only works long days, but also likes working a few hours on a Saturday too. Just like the previous table, it's important to add up all the cumulative hours to see when in February where Ben has exceeded his basic hours occurred. By the end of January, the previous month, Ben worked a total of 1,860 hours. We now add up every bit of time Ben has worked since the 1st of February. You can see here that the 10th of February is the day when Ben went over his yearly contractual hours of 1,924. From the 1st of April 2025 to the 10th of February 2026, Ben has worked a total of 1,930. We now need to find the adjusted working time for us to use in February's pay reference period calculation. Just to pre-warn you all, this is going to be very calculation heavy. The guidance breaks the calculation down into 4 steps, but for the purposes of this webinar, to break it down even further, I will be showing you in 6 stages. Stage 1. The number of days before the basic hours are exceeded divided by 365 days. In this case, it will be 9 days because the excess happened on the 10th of February. So 9 divided by 365 is 0.024. Stage 2. Multiply that answer by the annual basic hours. In this case, 1,924. So 0.024 times 1924 equals 46.18 hours. Let's just park that figure there for now because stages 3 and 4 are basically repeating the same calculation but for the number of days after the excess has occurred. Stage 3. The number of days after the breach divided by 365 days. There are 28 days in February. We've already accounted for 9 days previously, therefore the difference is 19 days. So that's 19 divided by 365, which is 0.052. Stage 4. Multiply that answer by the annual basic hours. In this case, it's 0.052 times 1,924, which equals 100 hours. Stage 5. Identify the actual hours worked over the basic. From the 10th of February until the end of the month, Ben has worked 135 hours. We then have to minus 3 hours because Ben could work 3 hours on the 10th of February and not be over the contracted hours for the year. The actual hours worked over the basic will be 132. Stage 6. Add all 3 results together. That's 46.18, the apportionment of time before the breach, plus 100, the apportionment of time after the breach, plus 132, the actual amount of additional time worked, equals 278.18. We now go back to the PRP calculation and use 278.18 as the working time figure. For February's pay reference period, we take Ben's minimum wage pay received, £2,375, divided by the new adjusted working time of 278.18, and that makes his hourly rate to be £8.53. That's below the national minimum wage rate of £12.21, meaning Ben has been underpaid. Ben should have received a minimum of £396.58 for working 278.18 hours. The difference of how much Ben received to how much he should have received, which is £3,396.58 less 2,375, is £1,021.58. That's effectively his underpayment that needs to be repaid back to him. But that's not the end of the story. Remember, there is still March to resolve. Thankfully, the calculation for March is much easier because we know that all working time performed in March is deemed as excess hours. In this scenario, we simply add his contractual hours of 160.33 to his actual working hours of 165 to give the new working time figure of 325.33 hours. 325.33 hours at £12.21 is £3,972.28. So, like in February, Ben has been underpaid again. This time it's for £1,597.28, which is the difference between £3,972.28 and how much he was actually paid of £2,375. Ben's total underpayment in this calculation year adds up to £2,618.86. I said in the brief introduction that the national minimum wage is more than just a rate, it's a calculation. I'm now hoping that everybody on this webinar can understand why. It's so easy to think in simple terms like, oh, this person has an underpayment because of unpaid working time, or this person has been underpaid because of a salary sacrifice. Yes, the reasons are important, but it's critical to understand that all the reasons form together in this calculation. You saw in Ben's example that simply having a salary sacrifice did not cause an underpayment. The unpaid working time may have been the main driving force behind the underpayment, but I want to point out that the underpayment would be less if he didn't have the salary sacrifice. This is a prime example of a worker being underpaid for more than one reason, and this is quite often the case. So many factors are taken into account when calculating the national minimum wage. I've seen this example so many times. And it's all these factors employers need to take into consideration. I've seen so many instances of employers offering salary sacrifice schemes, and to be fair to many of them, many employers do their due diligence. They know the sacrifice should not take workers' pay below national minimum wage, so they do an eligibility check at the beginning. Sounds good so far, doesn't it? What can go wrong? Well, how do you think a lot of employers do the eligibility check? They use the worker's contractual hours. And what did Ben's example prove? He was working way over his contractual hours. If Ben's employer, Cookie, used his actual hours instead of contractual, the eligibility check would have said no to the salary sacrifice. Or say if Cookie had checked the extra hours and paid Ben for his time, then the salary sacrifice would not be an issue. So bear this in mind when it comes to salary sacrifice or any other deductions that could reduce pay for national minimum wage purposes. And just to finish off this section, before I move on to additional points to consider, the example I've gone through is obviously an extreme case from a working time perspective. It does happen though, and it's a good one to show the calculations. However, what is incredibly common is when workers come in a little bit earlier, say you're an employer who want their staff to come in 15 minutes earlier, it's the same principle. It's additional working time, and this needs to be included as an excess hours check. Let's consider some additional points. The example I went through was just one scenario, and as we all know, real life can be varied. Though I didn't cover them in the example, I'm going to talk about two additional points. These are absences and calculation year alterations. Let's get started with absences. When workers are absent but receive their full pay as per their contract, there is no adjustment for working time in the pay reference period when the worker takes an absence because it's part of their contractual pay. This could include things like annual leave, sick absences, and paid lunch breaks. Let's say in September, Ben was on paid annual leave for a week. His pay did not alter. He was effectively receiving the same amount of pay he received in any other month, £2,375. But when it comes to his working time, you would think his working time would be his contractual hours for the month, in this case 160.33, minus 37 hours, making his new hours for the month to be 123.33 hours. After all, he's not working, is he? However, it doesn't matter. For national minimum wage purposes, a worker performing salaried hours work would not have their working time altered for these types of absences. And in Ben's case, there should not be a 37-hour reduction of working time. But what about unpaid absences, or absences where the pay is reduced? Well, this is different. In these instances, the absence is removed from their contractual basic hours for the pay reference period the absence is taken. So let's pretend Ben has used all of his annual leave, but he has accidentally booked a holiday. His employer allows Ben to take leave, but it will be unpaid. Ben has no issue with this and takes a week off as unpaid leave, and in this case, that is 37 hours. In the pay reference period the unpaid absence occurs, 37 hours needs to be removed from his basic contractual hours. So 160.33 minus 37 gives us 123.33 hours. His employer, Cookie, can base his national minimum wage pay against the reduced hours of 123.33 to check his minimum wage hourly rate. Now, I just want to stress that this reduction in hours only applies to the pay reference period calculation. This does not reduce the basic contractual hours for the calculation year. So in Ben's case, when Cookie performs an excess hours check, they must still use 1,924 hours. This figure cannot be reduced. So just a quick recap of the two types of absences. Paid absence, this does not reduce hours in the working time calculation. Reduced pay or zero pay absence. The time is removed from the contractual hours of the pay reference period, but not the basic contractual hours for the calculation year. Speaking of calculation years, that's a nice segue into another point to consider. Ben's example was nice and easy. He started employment on the 1st of April. Obviously, workers can start any day in a month. Their employment start date is linked to the calculation year. Say Ben started employment on the 15th of April 2025. The first calculation year will be between the 15th of April 2025 to the 30th of April 2026. For all subsequent years, it will be the 1st of May to the following 30th of April. You may have noticed the first calculation year is longer than the calendar year. The first pay reference period will be less than 1 month, and a pro rata calculation is required to identify the time being treated as working time. The formula to be used is basic hours multiply number of shortened days divided by 365. What does that look like in practice? Okay, so let's pretend Ben started on the 15th of April 2025. We know his basic contractual hours is 1,924. Ben only started work on the 15th of April, and as there are only 30 days in April, that means there are only 15 days in this pay reference period. Just to confirm, we use days, not working days, just days. Using everything we know, the formula would be 1,924 times 15 divided by 365. The answer gives us 79.07 hours. So for the initial shorter pay reference period, the contractual hours of 79.07 will need to be used, but every pay reference period following, the hours of 160.33 will need to be used. The total number of hours for this slightly longer calculation year will now be 2003.07. I want to point out that this pro rata calculation only needs to be done if the start date differs from the pay reference date. As we said in the original example, Ben's pay reference period starts on the 1st of the month and ends on the last day of the month. Say if the pay reference started on the 15th of the month, then no pro-rating is. Now, there are examples relating to weekly paid workers or for weekly paid workers, but I would recommend looking at the online guidance in these scenarios. Now, what happens when a person leaves partway through a calculation year? You will need to recalculate the basic hours up to the point of their leaving to determine whether they have worked more hours than their basic hours for the part year. To explain how this works, let's go back and look at Ben. In Ben's second year, he decides to leave on the 15th of September 2026. So going back to the original example, Ben's calculation year is from the 1st of April to the 31st of March the following year. His basic hours for the calculation year are 1,924. Cookie has been monitoring Ben's hours and know at the time of leaving on the 15th of September, he has worked 905 hours. We know from this that Ben has not exceeded his 1,924 basic hours for the calculation year. However, as Ben did not work the full year and left partway through the pay reference period, we'll have to complete a pro rata calculation to adjust the time treated as worked in the final pay reference period and check to see if he has worked more hours than the basic hours for the part of the year he was employed. To calculate the time treated as worked in the final pay reference period, we're using the following calculation: basic hours times number of days in shortened PRP divided by 365. So 1,924 times 15 divided by 365 equals 79.07. Now that we've established the time treated as worked in the final pay reference period, we need to add these hours to the total basic hours for the calculation year up to the point of leaving. This will allow us to compare the total hours Ben has worked within the adjusted basic hours to account for him leaving partway through the year. Here, the basic hours for the calculation year up to the point of leaving is 880.72. That's 801.65 for the 1st of April to the 31st of August. That's 5 months of 160.33 hours. And 79.07 hours for the period the 1st of September to the 15th of September. Any hours worked in excess of the adjusted basic hours should be paid in addition to the adjusted basic hours in the final pay reference period. In this example, we know that Ben has worked 905 hours and has therefore exceeded the 880.72 adjusted basic hours. This means that Ben should be paid at least national minimum wage for 103.35 hours. That's 79.07 hours treated as worked in the final PRP, plus the excess of 24.28 hours. The difference between the hours Ben worked, 905, and the adjusted basic hours, 880.72. And finally, the last calculation year alteration we will be talking about in this webinar is changing the calculation year. Say, if you're a small business, you may have a number of workers with different calculation years. If you're a large business with a large workforce, even more so. However, to make life easier, employers can change the calculation year for each of their salaried workers. An employer may change a worker's calculation year by written notice to the worker as long as you give at least 3 months notice of the new calculation year and include an explanation of the effect of the change. There is no upper limit on how much notice an employer can give. You do not receive a written objection from the worker before the first day of the new calculation year. It is good practice for employers to acknowledge receipt of any such objection, but not a requirement under the law. Where a worker makes a written objection, their calculation year remains unchanged. An employer may give a further notice to the worker whenever they wish, providing they always give at least 3 months notice, which the worker may of course also object to if they wish. The worker's calculation year has not previously been changed within a period of 6 years ending with the first day of the proposed new calculation year. You do not make any deductions from wages or require the worker to make a payment or work additional hours as a result of the change. With the exception of the final requirement, these requirements do not apply to new joiners. Specifically, where on the new calculation year begins the worker has been employed for less than 3 months, the employer can give written notice and need only comply with the final bullet point. Namely, the employer must not make any deductions from wages or require the worker to make a payment or work additional hours as a result of the change. Where a new calculation year has been specified, in each subsequent year, the worker's calculation year begins on the anniversary of the first day of the new calculation year. For example, if an employer successfully changed a worker's calculation year to the 1st of January, each subsequent calculation year would begin on the 1st of January. Now let's move on to the next section, record keeping. When it comes to record keeping, the example we went through together was the best possible scenario. In real life, employers do not tend to keep working time records for salaried workers. The amount of times I've heard they're salaried workers, they don't need to record their hours. Well, the problem is, if you don't keep an accurate working time record, how can you demonstrate you are paying your workers at least the national minimum wage? For example, I'm supposed to work 37 hours per week. However, I do not work exactly 37 hours per week. Some weeks it may be 38, other weeks it may be 36. What employees need is to have some type of reporting facility so they can track working hours. We can't advise you how to do it. That's completely up to you. For example, you can make a simple spreadsheet, or you can have an all singing, all dancing time and attendance system. It doesn't matter as long as you can demonstrate working time. If you have the working time records, you can track every pay reference period in the calculation year in real time. That means you don't need to wait until the end of the calculation year. It means that if you identify a problem, you can resolve it. For example, let's say Ben's employer, Cookie, was switched on about salaried work for minimum wage purposes. They knew about the salary sacrifice reducing pay. They understood about calculation years and excess hours. In month 10, Cookie can see the total number of hours Ben has worked for minimum wage purposes is 1,860. They realise this is dangerously close to his yearly contractual hours of 1,924. In fact, they know if Ben simply performs his usual contractual hours of 160.33 for the month, he has gone over his basic hours. Ben has 64 hours left until the end of his calculation year. At this point, Cookie has a couple of options. They could tell Ben to only work a total of 64 hours over months 11 and 12. Obviously, they still need to pay Ben's normal pay of £2,375 for the months in question. Or Ben continues to work his basic hours plus more, and the company will perform a manual adjustment to working time to calculate how much Ben needs to be paid for minimum wage purposes and pay him any difference. And that right there is the point of record keeping. It empowers the employer to make a decision on how they want to proceed. It stops an employer from underpaying their workers because they can resolve the problem before it even becomes a problem. Employers are legally required to keep sufficient records to show they are meeting their national minimum wage requirements. But what do we mean by this? We mentioned time records, but these are not the only type of records that are relevant. The types of business records which may be relevant include PAYE records, such as pay slips and details of each pay element, contracts of employment, contracts of apprenticeship, training arrangements, staff handbook, timesheets and clocking in systems, staff rotas, cash books, bank statements. This is not an exhaustive list, and as computerized systems and electronic systems evolve, this can present new challenges to employers. Modern payroll systems can include several component parts, including time and attendance systems, HR systems, benefit portals, and payroll systems. All these components can include information and records that are required for an employer to be able to demonstrate national minimum wage compliance. We find that employers don't understand the systems that they use or rely on. This can be because they contract out certain payroll functions to third parties, or perhaps they don't understand the reporting functions of the systems that they use. Many systems can manipulate or change data. For example, a time and attendance system might round up or down clocking in or out times according to the system presets, or incorrectly decimalize time. These changes may not be known to the employer or apparent from standard reports. Employers may not be able to access the data that is needed to demonstrate national minimum wage compliance. This might be because they have changed systems or software and historical data has been archived. Or it might be because the contract they have with a third-party provider limits them to what is readily available. We often find that data is incomplete. This can be due to inconsistencies in data input or faults in systems. This can lead to there being gaps in the national minimum wage records audit trail for workers. We find that data or report from systems is not enough to allow for us to understand the national minimum wage position. For example, where a system allows for the creation of pay codes, there may not be an audit trail that fully explains what that code is actually for. There may have been people who understood it in the past, but those people have left the business and the corporate memory has been lost. We recommend that employers think about what steps they might take in order to satisfy themselves that they can demonstrate national minimum wage compliance. This could include take steps to ensure that systems used for payroll processes provide the records needed for national minimum wage purposes. If services are contracted out, it is still the employer's responsibility to keep, maintain, and be able to access the records. If systems are changed, be aware that records still need to be accessible for 6 years. Maintain a corporate memory of payroll systems and elements of pay. Introduce checks to ensure workers are paid correctly. Make sure that the people who are responsible for payroll within your organisation have the right training. And that leads us nicely into our next and final segment. What happens when problems occur? HMRC has a dedicated national minimum wage department. Not only do we do proactive work, like educating employers and workers, we are responsible for enforcement on behalf of the Department for Business and Trade. We open thousands of compliance checks into businesses each year, and we find employers have underpaid their workers. We serve notices of underpayment where we instruct employers to repay arrears back to workers. Employers are charged a 200% penalty on the underpaid amount with a cap of £20,000 per worker, and employers are publicly named by the Department for Business and Trade. And it doesn't matter whether the employer has accidentally underpaid their workers, they are subject to the same sanctions regardless. And in some cases, employers can be prosecuted because certain breaches are deemed as criminal offences. One example is not keeping sufficient records. I want to stress that sanctions only occur if there is enforcement action, i.e. HMRC opens a compliance check. This could be because we receive a worker complaint. Workers can complain directly to us, and we receive thousands each year. Or we could open a compliance check because we are looking at a certain location of the UK, or the business is part of a sector where data suggests that there is a potential minimum wage issue. The situation, however, is completely different if the company resolves the problem outside of a compliance check. Say this webinar has highlighted a problem for you, so you decide to review your own records and determine there are underpayments. There is a facility in place for you to notify HMRC, and as long as you have made the payments back to workers, you will not be penalised or named. All you need to do is email voluntarydeclaration.nmw@hmrc.gov.uk advising you have identified an underpayment and repaid the workers. You will then receive a quick form to complete. This creates an audit trail on our records which confirms that we should not name or penalise you for those workers with the amount underpaid. I highly recommend the voluntary declaration process. We know mistakes are easy to make, but as long as you rectify the mistake without HMRC intervention, you will not be named or penalised. It's the main reason why we are doing this webinar. We want to help you get the minimum wage right, so there's either no underpayment, or if there is, you as an employer can regulate your own compliance. We're nearly at the end of the webinar now. Here's a summary of what we've covered today. A brief introduction to work type and establishing salaried hours work, an example going through each calculation step by step, additional points to consider, the importance of keeping records, and what happens when problems occur. Our full range of help and guidance can be viewed online from your mobile, tablet, or PC at any time. Links to further help and guidance are included in the handouts. And as per the beginning of this presentation, should you have any queries, you can email nmw_promote_mailbox@hmrc.gov.uk and we shall try to answer any of your questions. You can find the email address in the handouts. When the webinar has closed, you'll be directed to a short survey. Your feedback is very useful and helps us keep developing our webinars. As a reminder, a few hours after the webinar closes, you will receive an email with a link to this recording and the handouts from today's session. Thank you to everyone involved in today's webinar and also to those who have attended. It will now go quiet for you to download the handouts. Thank you and goodbye.